Okay, so here is the video for Chapter 2, Section 1. So let's go ahead and get into that. We're going to discuss the early history of the American colonies, compare and contrast the European connection, and analyze early documents that shape the United States government. So it's a lot of American history in this section here. So, like we talked about before, when people began to come to America from England in the 1600s, they brought with them the ideas of England. Now, England is ran by a monarch or a king or queen, and this relationship to the monarch affected the early settlers. Some people were extremely loyal to the king. Some people didn't like the king. They felt like he abused his power. And because of this, this is going to lead to tensions later on. Now, as early on when they first get to the colony, there is a lot of people that support the king. For the most part, they consider themselves to be British subjects. But as time goes on, they start to get very frustrated with the way the king's doing things, and that's going to lead to the American Revolution. Now, just a few things, and there's some videos on some of these things. I know there's a video on the Magna Carta on Google Classroom, so you need to watch those videos. It can help you understand the subject a little bit better. But the Magna Carta is an agreement that the nobles made the king sign. Basically, the king was treating the nobles and everybody else very poorly, and they didn't like that. So because of it, they made him sign the Magna Carta, which gave the nobles rights. It basically said, look, we have certain rights that you or no government can take away from us, and we want you to acknowledge that by signing this document. Well, at first the king didn't want to, but they wound up forcing him to do it. And when he did, it gave them certain rights, one of which gave them the right to a jury trial, which is very important because a jury trial makes sure that corrupt judges aren't accusing people of crimes and convicting them of crimes that they didn't do just because the judge doesn't like them. And so that gives them this idea they can be protected because a jury will hear the stuff, and they're not supposed to be biased. They're not supposed to care one way or the other. And so that way it holds the judges more accountable. The Magna Carta, which means Great Charter, it's Latin for Great Charter, protected the nobles and forced the king to give them rights. In 1215, the nobles rebelled and forced the king to sign the Magna Carta. It gave rights to certain landowners, but those rights eventually trickled down to all English people. They included equal treatment under the law and a trial before one's peers. It was going to be the basis before the rights given to Americans in the foundation of the country. Now, this is going to be big for the American settlers, the people that are coming and settling in the New World, because they're going to look at this and say, we got rights, rights that the government can't take away. And this is going to continue to go on. This mentality that we have certain unalienable rights that no government can take away from us. And this is the rights that are given in like the Bill of Rights and things like that. That we have rights that the government can't take away, such as the freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom to petition the government, the right to bear arms, for not to have soldiers quartered in your homes. Those kind of things are going to be in the Bill of Rights because the people are going to say, we got certain rights that the king doesn't have the right to take away. So the Magna Carta was a very big deal. Even though it's British history, it still is a big deal for American history. Henry III met regularly with a group of nobles and religious leaders, and over time, this group grew to include representatives and common people. This is going to form Parliament, which is a legislature or a lawmaking body. It's what Congress is for us in the United States. Parliament is the lawmaking body of England. And again, there's a video on Parliament on Google Classroom. I advise you to go watch that. You'll get a little bit more information on what Parliament is if you do that. In the early years, the king and Parliament worked with each other, but in the mid-1600s, they began to have a power struggle. Now, we see this even right now when it comes to the president and Congress, maybe not this moment with Joe Biden because he just became president and the Democrats have control of the Senate and the House. But there was always a conflict, especially between the House of Representatives and Donald Trump, because one's controlled by the Democrats and Donald Trump was a Republican. And so you see this constant struggle. Donald Trump coming out against the House of Representatives, them coming out against him. And so power struggles are inevitable. It's going to happen. And there's power struggles between the king and Parliament. There was a transfer of power from the monarch to the Parliament called the Glorious Revolution. And again, this is British history, but it's important because this is a big part of what sets up our government. This guaranteed that no monarch would ever have more power than Parliament. And in 1689, Parliament drew up the English Bill of Rights, which is going to be the basis for our Bill of Rights that we put in the Constitution. In the early days, there was no written law in England. They would come up with ideas for laws and enforce them. This is what's known as common law. It's a system of law based on precedent and customs, and precedent is just a ruling from an earlier case that was similar. So you'll hear me say in class a lot, this is setting up a dangerous precedent, or the precedent of this is, which means that they were just looking at something that happened before. So say, for example, in class, if someone is, say somebody is not staying in their seat, and so I take them to the office and I have them put in ISS because they won't stay in their seat. Well, then the next time somebody's up walking around, they won't stay in their seat. If I say, okay, well, what do I need to do about this? What is my punishment for them need to be? Well, precedent says they should go to ISS because that's what I did for the other person. You know, it's the punishment meets the crime thing. You know, there are certain crimes that end up in certain punishments. And they'll say, okay, well, based on this court case, this is the rule they came up with, and so that's what they're going to need to do again. And precedent isn't law, but a lot of times it determines how the law is interpreted. In the 1600s and 1700s, England was busy establishing colonies in America. Now, a colony is a group of people in one place who are ruled by a parent country. And the early colonists were loyal to the king and to England. So the colonies were set up in England, or in the United States, or what would become the United States, by England. We didn't come in with the intention of just coming up with our own country. We originally came here to colonize, to expand the English empire, to expand the empire of what would become Great Britain. And so that was the intention. That's the reason why a lot of the early settlers considered themselves to be British subjects, because they were there by the British to establish a British colony. And that's kind of the idea. So they were loyal to the king and England early on. The first permanent settlement in North America was at Jamestown in Virginia. And Jamestown was founded in 1607 by the Virginia Company, which was a group of merchants from London with a charter by King James I, which is just a written document granting land and authority to set up government. So this is what would happen. The king would grant a charter for people to go and colonize. That just means that the king approved for them to go colonize. It didn't mean they were their own separate country. It meant that they went under the flag of England by the authority of the king to set up a colony that would be an English colony. Jamestown was the first one that was permanent. Now, of course, we've talked before about the lost colony of Roanoke, and that was one of the first colonies that was settled, but it didn't last. Jamestown is going to be permanent. It's going to last. And so it was founded by the Virginia Company, which had a charter by King James I. The Jamestown colony was ruled by a governor and a council appointed by the Virginia Company. And in 1619, 2 people were voted from each county to meet with the governor and his council. These 22 people were called burgesses. These are what we would call representatives today. So what happens is the Jamestown colony sets up a government. They have a governor and a council. Now, they would have 2 people that would be from each county that would go and meet up with the governor. These were representatives, and they were called burgesses. So the Virginia House of Burgesses is the first representative assembly. There's also a video, I believe, about the Virginia House of Burgesses. Now, why the Virginia House of Burgesses is important is because it was the first time in North America that a representative assembly was established by the British. or the colonists. Now, we don't, in terms of like the Native Americans, they would meet together and they would have representatives in their different confederacies and things like that. But for the most, in terms of our government that was set up by the British as the 13 original colonies, this was the first representative assembly. This was the first time the people got a say in their vote. They're coming from a place with a king that decides everything, except for, of course, later on when Parliament and the Glorious Revolution, it's going to allow for people to have a little more of an impact. But you're not getting out to meet together in this new land, except for when it starts here with the House of Burgesses. So that's an important part. The reason why the Virginia House of Burgesses is important is the first representative assembly. Now, it had little power, but marked the first self-government in colonial history. In 1624, King Charles I canceled the charter and made it a, quote, royal colony. This means it would be controlled by the king. Basically, with a charter, if you lost everything, that wasn't up to the king. That was just, you lost your money. Now, that means that the king starts taking over what's going on in the colony. He appointed a new governor, but he allowed the House of Burgesses to continue. That would prove to be a mistake, because as the people continued to get a taste of democracy, they wouldn't want to go back to the way things were before. In 1620, a new group of colonists landed in America that were called Pilgrims. They built a settlement called Plymouth, hundreds of miles north of Virginia, and this is where the Pilgrims were going to land. And they wrote the Mayflower Compact. Now, there's a video that's on Google Classroom called the Mayflower Voyages, which is it's a Charles Schulz that makes the Peanuts cartoons. It's a Peanuts cartoon based on this. It's very good. It's kiddie because it's made for kids mostly, but it's very good about explaining the Pilgrim's adventure over. It's only like a 5-minute clip of like a 30-minute part of the special called "This Is America," Charlie Brown. But it's a very good little video. Now, the Mayflower Compact is important because it was the first written plan for government. Today, we call it a constitution. At the time, the Mayflower Compact was the first constitution written on in the colonies in North America, the first written plan for government. So we have the House of Burgesses, which is the first representative assembly, and the Mayflower Compact, which is the first written plan for government, which is going to set the precedent, as I said, for stuff like Congress and the Constitution. A compact just means it's an agreement or a contract, and the signers pledge to obey the laws that were written up to rule them. Now, it was never meant to be something that lasted for a long period of time, just basically get the Plymouth colony up and going. The Mayflower Compact developed a form of direct democracy that was common in the founding of the country through town hall meetings. They have town hall meetings where they meet together and vote on things. The success of Jamestown and Plymouth led to the rise of more colonies in America. Following the House of Burgesses and the Mayflower Compact, this would be the example going forward to set up the government. As time went on, the colonists would start developing their own roads, schools, hospitals, and starting to make their own decisions. This is going to lead to the government we have today. So that brings us to the end of section 1, and so now we're going to move on into section 2.